Eleanor sat on a porch that wasn't supposed to exist, attached to a home that defied all reason. The soft glow of a single, unadorned bulb pushed back the encroaching twilight, illuminating the weathered steel of the Pullman car she now called home. Her husband, Arthur, sat beside her in a chair he had built from salvaged oak, his gnarled hands resting on his knees, quiet and still. Their cat, a marmalade tabby named Winston, slept soundly on the porch railing, a furry sentinel guarding their improbable peace. They had been kicked out, discarded by their own flesh and blood, left with nothing but a few $100, a lifetime of memories, and a cat. They had been told their lives were over, that they were a burden to be managed. But then they bought a rusted, forgotten train car, and with their own 2 hands, their own tired bones, they built this. They built a home. They built a sanctuary. They built a life from the wreckage of another, stunning the very people who had cast them aside. But to understand the quiet victory of this moment, the profound peace in the gentle hum of the porch light, you have to go back. You have to go back to the day the world fell out from under them. It began with a signature. Just a simple scrawl of ink on a sheaf of important-looking papers. Richard, their son, had explained it all in his smooth, confident voice, the one he used for business deals. It was about estate planning. It was about simplifying things. It was about protecting their assets, ensuring a seamless transition when the time came. "It just makes sense, Mom," he had said, his hand resting reassuringly on Eleanor's shoulder. "This way, the house is protected. No probate, no taxes, no fuss. You and Dad will own it in spirit, live here for the rest of your days, just like always. This is just a formality. A piece of paper." Eleanor, a bookkeeper for 35 years, had felt a flicker of unease. Her entire career had been built on the principle that there was no such thing as just a piece of paper. Every document had a purpose, every number a consequence. But this was Richard. Her son. He was successful, wore sharp suits, and spoke of investments and portfolios with an easy fluency that both impressed and mystified her. He loved them. He wouldn't mislead them. Arthur, for his part, had trusted his son implicitly. Arthur's world was one of tangible things, the grain of wood, the heft of a hammer, the satisfying fit of a well-made joint. The abstract world of legal documents was a foreign language. If Richard said it was for the best, it was for the best. So they signed. Eleanor's signature was neat and practiced. Arthur's was the careful, heavy script of a man more comfortable with a saw than a pen. They signed away the house they had bought 52 years ago. The house where they had brought home 2 babies, Richard and his younger sister, Susan. The house where Arthur had built the kitchen cabinets, the bookshelves in the living room, the rocking horse that both his children and then his grandchildren had ridden. They signed it over, and for 3 months, nothing changed. Life continued its comfortable, predictable rhythm. Arthur tended his small garden. Eleanor did the crossword and balanced their modest budget to the penny. Winston sunned himself in the bay window. They were retired, content, secure in the fortress of their long life together. The knock on the door came on a Tuesday morning. It was Richard, but he wasn't alone. A woman in a crisp blazer stood beside him, holding a clipboard and smiling a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mom, Dad," Richard began, avoiding their eyes. "This is Carol. The house has sold. The new owners will be taking possession in 1 week." The words did not compute. They hung in the air of the entryway, nonsensical and bizarre. Arthur frowned, his brow furrowing. "Sold? What are you talking about, son? This is our house." "Technically, it's my house," Richard said, and for the first time, his voice had a hard, impatient edge. "And I sold it. A fantastic opportunity came up, a commercial real estate deal I couldn't pass up. This is our big break." "Our?" The word twisted in Eleanor's stomach. "But, where will we live?" she asked, her voice a small, thin thing. "I've taken care of everything," Richard announced, his buoyancy returning, false and jarring. "I've found the most wonderful place for you. A top-of-the-line assisted living community. It's called Oak Meadows. Meals, activities, medical staff on site. You won't have to worry about a thing ever again." He beamed as if he had just given them a winning lottery ticket. The woman, Carol, chimed in. "It's a lovely facility. We have a room all ready for you." "A room?" "One room." Eleanor looked past Richard, through the open door to the living room Arthur had paneled in warm cherry wood. She saw the armchair where she read every evening, the faint impression of her body still visible in the cushions. She saw the mantelpiece Arthur had carved, covered in framed photos of the very children who were now evicting them. "No," Arthur said. The word was quiet but immovable, like a granite boulder. "We're not going to any facility." Richard's face tightened. "Dad, be reasonable. This is a good thing. The upkeep on this place is too much for you. It's for your own good." "Our own good." Eleanor's voice found its strength, laced with a cold fury she hadn't felt in decades. "You lied to us, Richard. You had us sign our home away and you lied." "I didn't lie. I simplified the estate," he snapped, his composure finally cracking. "Things changed. Opportunities arise. You have to be agile in this world." He looked at them, at their confused, wounded faces, and his expression shifted to one of deep, patronizing pity. "You wouldn't understand the kind of pressure I'm under." The week was a blur of surreal horror. Richard and Carol, the real estate agent, were suddenly fixtures in the house, talking about staging and curb appeal. They put little sticky notes on the furniture they deemed worth keeping for the move to Oak Meadows. The rocking horse was not one of them. The bookshelves were not one of them. Arthur's workbench was not one of them. Eleanor tried calling Susan, her daughter. She got voicemail. She left a frantic, pleading message. Susan finally called back 2 days later. Her voice was strained, distant. "Mom, Richard explained it all to me. Maybe it's for the best. You guys aren't getting any younger. He's throwing us out of our home, Susan." There was a pause. "He said he found you a really nice place. He said he's handling it." A sigh. "I can't get in the middle of this, Mom. Rick knows what he's doing with money." The betrayal from Susan, quiet and compliant, was in some ways sharper than Richard's aggressive avarice. Richard was a shark, you could at least see his teeth. Susan was the slow tide that simply receded, leaving you stranded. The final day arrived. A small moving van, not for their things but for them, was parked in the driveway. Richard had packed 2 suitcases for each of them. He was brisk, efficient, eager to be done with the unpleasantness. Arthur stood in the center of the empty living room, his hands hanging uselessly at his sides. He looked like a great, old tree that had been struck by lightning, still standing but hollowed out from the inside. "We're not going," Eleanor said, her voice flat. She was holding Winston, the cat carrier clutched in her other hand. Oak Meadows doesn't allow pets. It was a small, practical fact, but it had become her shield. Richard threw his hands up in exasperation. "For God's sake, Mom, it's a cat. You can't derail your future over a cat." "This is not our future," she said. The argument was short and ugly. Richard's patience, already thin, evaporated completely. He was a man on a schedule, and his elderly parents were a deeply inconvenient line item. "Fine," he said, his voice dripping with venom. "Fine. You want to be stubborn? You want to throw away this perfect solution I've arranged? Fine." He grabbed their suitcases. He grabbed the small box of personal papers Eleanor had insisted on keeping. He herded them out of the house, their house, and into his sleek, black sedan. He didn't take them to Oak Meadows. He drove them 20 miles to the neighboring town, to a part of it they never visited, where the streets were wider and emptier and the buildings had a tired, forgotten look. He pulled into the parking lot of the Starlight Motel, a long, low building with a flickering neon sign and peeling paint. He got out, opened the trunk, and set their 4 suitcases and the cat carrier on the cracked asphalt. He walked to Eleanor's window and pushed a thin envelope through the opening. "There's $500 in there," he said, his voice cold and devoid of emotion. "It should last you until you come to your senses and call Oak Meadows. They're holding the room for a week." Eleanor stared at him, her face a mask of disbelief. "Richard. You did this to yourselves," he said, cutting her off. He got back in his car, not looking at them, and drove away, leaving them in a cloud of exhaust and incomprehension. Eleanor and Arthur stood in the parking lot of the Starlight Motel. He was 82. She was 79. They had 4 suitcases, 1 cat in a carrier, and $500 to their name. The life they had meticulously built over half a century had been dismantled and discarded in the space of a single week. They were invisible. They were nothing. The low point had arrived, and it was a desolate, windswept parking lot under a pale, indifferent sky. The room at the Starlight Motel smelled of stale cigarette smoke and bleach. A brown floral bedspread covered a mattress that sagged in the middle. The air conditioner rattled and groaned, producing more noise than cool air. A single, high window looked out onto the parking lot where their son had abandoned them. Arthur sat on the edge of the bed, his shoulders slumped. He hadn't spoken a word since Richard drove away. He just stared at the worn, grey carpet, his hands, those capable, clever hands, lying limp in his lap. Eleanor watched him, a knot of fear tightening in her chest. The shock was wearing off, replaced by a cold, terrifying clarity. She opened the cat carrier. Winston emerged cautiously, his nose twitching. He sniffed the unfamiliar territory, his tail low, and then went to Arthur, rubbing against his leg, purring loudly. Arthur didn't seem to notice. Eleanor methodically unpacked their suitcases, a lifetime of possessions now reduced to a few changes of clothes, their toiletries, and the small box of papers. She placed Arthur's heart medication on the rickety nightstand. She set out Winston's food and water bowls. The mundane tasks were an anchor in the swirling chaos of her thoughts. She didn't call Richard. She would never call Richard again. She called Susan. Voicemail. She left a message, her voice trembling. "Susan, it's Mom. Richard, he left us at a motel. The Starlight Motel. Please call me back." She waited. The minutes stretched into an hour. The sun began to set, painting the dirty window with streaks of orange and purple. The neon sign outside flickered to life, casting a sickly pink glow into the room. Her phone remained silent. The silence was the answer. Susan was not coming. No one was coming. "He never liked that cat," Arthur said, his voice raspy. It was the first thing he'd said. He was looking at Winston, who had curled up on his feet. "No," Eleanor agreed. "He never did." The first few days were a fugue state of shame and disorientation. They were afraid to leave the room, as if their invisibility was a cloak that might be disturbed. They ate vending machine crackers and the sad, plastic-wrapped pastries that passed for a continental breakfast. The $500 was dwindling at an alarming rate. Eleanor knew they couldn't stay there. She called the local police department, her voice shaking as she explained their situation. The officer on the other end was polite but firm. "I understand you're upset, but if you signed the house over to your son, it's his property. It sounds like a civil matter. You'll need to talk to a lawyer." A lawyer. The word was a mockery. Lawyers cost money, money they no longer had. Their savings, their nest egg, had been equity in a house that was no longer theirs. The system, the official channels, had no place for them. They had fallen through the cracks. On the 4th day, Eleanor couldn't stand the stale air of the motel room any longer. She told Arthur she was going for a walk. He just nodded, his eyes fixed on the television, where a game show host was shouting at a deliriously happy couple. She walked until she found the town's public library. The building was old brick, solid and reassuring. Inside, it was quiet and warm. It smelled of paper and dust and knowledge. For the first time in days, Eleanor felt a sliver of her old self return. This was a place of order and information. This was a place she understood. She sat at a public computer terminal, the plastic keys cool beneath her fingertips. She began to search. Rentals. Apartments. Rooms for rent. The prices were a cruel joke. Even the most squalid studio apartment required a security deposit and first month's rent that was more than double what they had left. Despair began to creep back in. She felt a tear slide down her cheek and quickly wiped it away. A librarian, a woman with kind eyes and graying hair, came over. "Are you all right, dear?" Eleanor couldn't bring herself to tell the whole story. "Just having a tough day," she managed. The librarian nodded, giving her a small, sympathetic smile. "The world can be a hard place. Tea is in the back if you need a moment." Eleanor spent the rest of the day at the library. It became her sanctuary. Every morning, she would walk the 2 miles from the Starlight Motel, leaving Arthur to his silent vigil with the television. She searched real estate listings, classifieds, anything. She expanded her search terms, growing more desperate. Land for sale, fixer-upper, as is. The results were mostly barren plots of land they couldn't afford or dilapidated houses that would require a fortune to repair. She was about to give up for the day, her shoulders aching with tension, when she stumbled upon it. It was on a fringe website for unusual sales, a digital clearinghouse for the strange and unwanted. The listing was terse, almost comical in its bluntness. For sale, retired Pullman car, 1948. As is, where is? Good bones, needs everything. Buyer responsible for removal. $5,000. There was one grainy photo. It showed a long, dark green cylinder of steel, sitting on a disconnected piece of track, surrounded by overgrown weeds. Rust bloomed along its seams, and its windows were clouded with grime. It looked less like a potential home and more like a relic from a forgotten age, slowly surrendering to the earth. Eleanor stared at the picture. It was absurd. It was insane. It was a rusted metal tube. But then she clicked on the satellite view. The listing was for the car itself, but the small print mentioned the land it sat on. It was a quarter-acre parcel, a defunct railroad siding that had been sliced off from a larger property decades ago and forgotten. The county was selling it for back taxes. The price was $3,000. Her bookkeeper's mind began to churn, the familiar comfort of numbers and calculations pushing back the fog of despair. $5,000 for the car. $3,000 for the land. $8,000. She checked their bank balance online. After the motel bill and their meager expenses, they had $8,427 left in the world. It was still a rusted metal tube. A wreck. A piece of junk. But it was a shell. It had a roof and walls. It was a structure. And it was something they could afford. It was the only thing they could afford. A spark, tiny and fragile, ignited within her. It was a wild, desperate, ridiculous idea. But it was an idea. And an idea was infinitely more than they had. She printed the listing, the grainy photo of the derelict train car looking even more pathetic on the cheap library paper. She folded it carefully and put it in her purse. That evening, when she returned to the motel room, she found Arthur exactly where she had left him. She turned off the blaring television. The sudden silence was heavy. "Arthur," she said, her voice steady. "I think I found something." She handed him the printout. He stared at the picture of the rusted Pullman car, his face blank. He read the description, then looked back at the photo. A flicker of something, confusion, maybe irritation, crossed his features. "It's a piece of junk, Eleanor," he said, his voice flat. He handed the paper back to her as if it were contaminated. "It's a scrap heap." "It's a structure," she countered, her voice quiet but firm. "It has walls. It has a roof. It's made of steel. It's a tin can in the middle of a weed patch." He shook his head and turned away, his brief spark of engagement extinguished. "Don't be foolish." Eleanor's own hope wavered. He was right. It was a foolish idea, born of desperation. They were old. They were tired. What were they going to do, live in a rusted train car like vagrants? The image of Richard's sneering face flashed in her mind. "This is pathetic." She sank onto the other sagging bed, the creak of the springs loud in the silent room. "Winston," sensing the shift in mood, hopped from Arthur's feet and came to her, headbutting her hand. She stroked his soft fur, the rhythmic purring a small comfort. She looked at her husband's back. She saw the stoop in his shoulders that hadn't been there a week ago. She saw the defeat in the way he held his head. This motel room, this limbo of shame and inactivity, was draining the life from him faster than any physical ailment. He was a man who had spent his entire life building, fixing, creating. Now, there was nothing for his hands to do. He was withering. The spark inside her flared again, this time with a stubborn heat. She would not let them wither away in this sad, beige room. "You built our house, Arthur," she said to his back. He didn't respond. "Not all of it," she continued, her voice gaining strength. "We bought the shell. But the rest of it, that was you. You built the kitchen from nothing but planks of pine. You put in the bookshelves where I kept all my ledgers. You built the back deck where we sat on summer evenings. You even fixed the roof after that big storm in '98. Everyone else was getting quotes for thousands. You did it yourself in a weekend." He turned his head slightly, just enough to show he was listening. "Your hands," she said, her voice softening. "Your hands know how to make things. They know how to build a home. They've been idle for too long." She stood up and walked over to him, placing the crumpled printout on the nightstand beside him. She took out a pen and a small notepad from her purse, the one she always carried. She began to write, her movements crisp and decisive. "The car is $5,000. The land is $3. That leaves us with $427, she narrated, the familiar act of accounting grounding her. "The motel is $65 a night. In less than a week, we'll have nothing left anyway. We'll be on the street, Arthur." She looked him straight in the eye. "This is a chance. It's a terrible chance. It's a crazy chance. But it's the only one we have." He looked from her determined face down to the grainy photograph. He picked it up again, his thumb rubbing over the image of the rusted steel. He stared at it for a long time. Eleanor could almost see the gears turning in his mind, the carpenter's eye beginning to measure, to assess, to see past the decay to the structure beneath. The frame would be solid steel, he murmured, almost to himself. They built these things to last. "Yes," Eleanor said, her heart leaping. "The roof is curved. That's good for shedding water, if it's sound. We can make it sound." He looked at the grime-caked windows. "There's light. A lot of windows." "I know." He finally lifted his gaze from the paper and met hers. The vacant, defeated look in his eyes was gone. In its place was a flicker of something she hadn't seen since the day Richard had walked in with the real estate agent. It was the look of a man facing a problem he might be able to solve. It was a look of purpose. "It's still a piece of junk," he said, but this time, there was no finality in his tone. There was a challenge. Eleanor held her breath. Arthur stood up, his back a little straighter. He walked over to the corner where his old, worn toolbag sat, one of the few personal items he had grabbed in the frantic final hours at their house. He unzipped it. The familiar scent of oil and sawdust filled a small corner of the stale motel room. "All right, Eleanor," he said, not looking at her, his hand closing around the wooden handle of his favorite hammer. "Let's go buy a train car." The transaction was as strange and forlorn as the property itself. The county clerk's office handled the sale of the land, a dusty, bureaucratic affair that involved triplicate forms and a bored-looking woman who didn't bat an eye at them paying in cash. The Pullman car was another matter. The owner was a man named Silas, the grandson of the railroad foreman who had originally bought the siding. They met him at a Greasy Spoon diner. He was a stooped man with a hacking cough who was just happy to be rid of the tax burden. He handed them a handwritten bill of sale and a rusty, antique key that he claimed was for the main door. "Good luck to YA," he'd said, pocketing their cash without counting it. "You're gonna need it." They drove their old, dented sedan to the property, the last of their money gone, their entire worldly fortune now sunk into a rusted metal tube and a patch of weeds. The car bumped down a gravel track that was barely a road, the suspension groaning in protest. And then they saw it. The photograph hadn't done it justice. It was bigger, longer, and more derelict than they had imagined. It loomed over the landscape of weeds and scrub brush, a monument to decay. The green paint was peeling in long strips, revealing a universe of rust underneath. A bird had made a nest in a broken window pane. Arthur got out of the car and walked slowly around the Pullman, his hand trailing along the cold, corrugated steel. Eleanor followed, clutching her purse, a feeling of overwhelming dread washing over her. What had they done? This wasn't a structure, it was a sarcophagus. Arthur stopped at the main door. He looked at the antique key in his hand, then at the lock, which was seized with a half-century of rust. He didn't even try it. He went back to the car, retrieved a crowbar from his tool bag, and with a grunt of effort, pried the door open. It screeched in protest, the sound of metal tearing metal. The inside was dark and smelled of damp, decay, and animal droppings. A thick layer of dust and grime covered everything. Faded, tattered velvet seats were still bolted to the floor in places, their stuffing spilling out like entrails. The air was heavy and still. This was their new home. They slept in the car that first night, the two of them cramped in the front seats, Winston curled up on the dashboard. Every time Eleanor closed her eyes, she saw Richard's face, heard his voice. Pathetic. The next morning, Arthur began to work. He didn't start with a grand plan. He started with the basics. He took the crowbar and a heavy-duty scraper and began to gut the interior. He ripped out the rotting seats, the peeling linoleum floor, the rusted luggage racks. It was brutal, back-breaking labor. Eleanor helped where she could, dragging debris out of the car and piling it up, her muscles screaming in protest. For 3 days, they did nothing but clean. They filled dozens of garbage bags with the detritus of 50 years. Slowly, painstakingly, they stripped the car down to its bare metal bones. It was still a hollow tube, but now it was an empty hollow tube. It was a blank slate. Arthur's first real act of construction was to find and patch the leaks. He climbed onto the curved roof, moving with a cautious certainty that belied his age. He found 3 places where the seams had rusted through. He meticulously cleaned the areas, applied a thick, black sealant, and then bolted heavy-gauge steel patches over them. That night, a light rain began to fall. They sat inside the car on 2 overturned buckets, listening. The rain pattered on the metal roof, a rhythmic drumming. But there were no drips. The patches were holding. It was a small victory, but it felt monumental. Their remaining $400 was disappearing fast. They bought a small, second-hand generator, a string of work lights, and fuel. That evening, Arthur fired up the generator. He ran a cord into the car and switched on the lights. The bare, clean interior was suddenly illuminated. For the first time, they could see the space not as a wreck, but as a possibility. It was long and narrow, but the ceiling was high. The row of large windows on either side promised light. Arthur stood in the middle of the car, bathed in the harsh glare of the work lights, a smile touching his lips for the first time in weeks. "It's still standing," he said softly. "Yes," Eleanor whispered. "It is." That single, generator-powered light bulb was a beacon. It was a declaration. It was proof that they were still here, that they had not vanished. They had taken the first, impossible step. They had taken back a sliver of agency in a world that had taken everything from them. They had begun to build. The initial momentum was hard to sustain. The small generator devoured fuel, and their remaining cash dwindled to almost nothing. Every purchase was a painful calculation. A box of screws versus a loaf of bread. A can of sealant versus a gallon of water. Arthur's old tools were a blessing, but he needed materials. He needed wood, insulation, wire, pipes. He needed things they could not afford. The breaking point came when his favorite handsaw, a tool he'd had for 40 years, finally gave up the ghost, its blade warped and its teeth worn to nubs. He sat on the floor of the train car, holding the useless tool, and Eleanor saw the flicker of purpose in his eyes dim once more. "I need a new saw," he said, the statement hanging in the air, heavy with the unspoken truth that they couldn't afford one. Then we'll get one, Eleanor said with a confidence she did not feel. The next morning, they drove to the nearest town, a small, unassuming place called Harmony Creek. It had a single main street with a post office, a diner, and a hardware store. The hardware store wasn't a big box chain, it was an old, independent place called Hobbs Hardware. A faded sign hung over a door with a bell that jingled when they entered. The store smelled of metal, sawdust, and oil, the scent of Arthur's entire working life. It was packed to the rafters with every conceivable tool and fastener, organized with a chaotic logic that only its owner could understand. Behind the counter stood a man about Arthur's age, with a full head of white hair, a flannel shirt, and a skeptical expression. A small, hand-painted sign identified him as George Hobbs, Prop. Arthur, deeply ashamed of their situation, was quiet. He walked directly to the aisle of handsaws, his posture stiff. He picked up a new saw, felt its weight, tested its balance. He looked at the price tag and his face fell. He put it back. Eleanor watched this silent, painful exchange. She walked up to the counter. "Excuse me," she said to George Hobbs. George looked her up and down, his eyes missing nothing, her worn coat, her husband's dejected stance, the worry etched on her face. "Help you?" he asked, his tone gruff and non-committal. "My husband is a carpenter," Eleanor began. We're working on a project. A renovation. He needs some materials. We were wondering if you might consider extending a line of credit." George's skepticism hardened into outright suspicion. "Credit? I run a hardware store, not a bank. I don't know you." "I know," Eleanor said, her cheeks flushing. "But he's good for it. He's never been late on a bill in his life," her voice cracked slightly. "Things are just difficult right now." George looked past her to Arthur, who was now examining a box of wood screws, pretending not to be part of the humiliating conversation. "What's your husband's name?" George asked. "Arthur. Arthur Jensen." George's eyes narrowed slightly. He came out from behind the counter and walked down the aisle toward Arthur. Eleanor's heart sank. She expected him to be thrown out. George stopped beside Arthur, not looking at the screws he was holding, but at his hands. Arthur's hands were gnarled with arthritis, the knuckles swollen, the skin like old leather. But they were the hands of a craftsman. The fingernails were clean but permanently grimed at the edges. A lifetime of skill was written in the calluses and scars. "You a carpenter?" George asked, his voice a low rumble. Arthur nodded, not meeting his eyes. "Retired." "No such thing," George grunted. "You're a carpenter till you're dead. What are you building?" Arthur hesitated. "Just fixing up an old place." George looked at the specific type of galvanized screws Arthur was holding. He looked at the high-quality saw he had been admiring. He recognized the choices of a professional, not a weekend hobbyist. A man who knew the difference between a tool that would last and one that would fail. "Let me see your hands," George said. It wasn't a request, it was a command. Confused, Arthur held out his hands, palms up. George took one of them, his own calloused hand surprisingly gentle. He turned it over, examining the palm, the fingers. It was like two old lions inspecting each other for signs of a long-fought life. George nodded slowly, a silent understanding passing between the two men. It was a recognition that transcended their immediate circumstances. It was the solidarity of a dying breed, of men who had built the world with their own two hands. He let go of Arthur's hand. "All right, Arthur Jensen," he said, his voice completely changed. The suspicion was gone, replaced by a matter-of-fact respect. "Let's get you what you need." He walked back to the counter, pulling out a dusty ledger and a pen. "I'll start you a tab. Pay me when you can. A man who knows his tools is good for it." Arthur stared at him, speechless. Eleanor felt a wave of relief so profound it almost buckled her knees. It wasn't charity. It was professional courtesy. It was an act of faith, the first one they had received from a stranger. it was a lifeline. They left Hobbs Hardware with a new saw, 3 pristine sheets of plywood, a box of screws, and a roll of heavy-duty insulation. The materials themselves were important, but they were secondary to what had really happened in that store. George Hobbs hadn't just given them credit. He had given them back a piece of their dignity. He had looked at Arthur and seen not a defeated old man, but a fellow tradesman. Back at the train car, Arthur's energy was transformed. The weariness was gone, replaced by a focused intensity. He set to work with the new saw, its sharp teeth biting into the fresh plywood with a satisfying rasp. The sound of construction, of creation, filled the air for the first time. He framed out a small wall, dividing the long tube into 2 sections. It was a simple, rough frame, but it was the first interior wall. It was the first act of imposing order on the chaos. Eleanor, using a tape measure and her trusty notepad, began to plan. She drew a floor plan, her mind, so long consumed with worry, now engaged in a complex puzzle. She designed a tiny, efficient galley kitchen along one wall. A compact bathroom at one end. A combined living and sleeping area. A small, separate space at the other end. Every inch was accounted for. Her plans were precise, her measurements exact. She was the observer, the planner. Arthur was the doer, the builder. For the first time in a long time, they were a team again, working in the silent, effortless synchronicity of their 52-year partnership. Days turned into a week. The pile of materials from Hobbs Hardware grew. Arthur worked from sunrise to sunset, fueled by Eleanor's carefully rationed sandwiches and a rediscovered sense of purpose. He insulated the floor and laid down the plywood subfloor. The cold, bare metal was covered, and for the first time, it felt less like a tin can and more like a room. They still slept in the car, but now their days were filled with progress. The single interior wall became 2. The rough framing for the kitchen cabinets went up. Eleanor found a discarded sink behind a plumbing supply store and cleaned it until it shone. One evening, as Eleanor was making notes in her ledger, meticulously tracking their debt to George Hobbs, she heard a hesitant voice from the open doorway of the train car. "Hello?" She looked up. A young woman stood there, silhouetted against the fading light. She was thin, with tired eyes, and she was visibly pregnant. She clutched a worn backpack to her chest like a shield. I saw the light," the young woman said, her voice trembling slightly. "I'm sorry to bother you. I was wondering if you had any water." The arrival of the young woman, whose name was Maya, marked the beginning of the next, unexpected phase of their project. She had been sleeping in the woods nearby, having fled an abusive boyfriend in a town 50 miles away. She was 19, 6 months pregnant, and utterly alone. Eleanor saw in Maya's eyes the same desperate fear she had felt in the parking lot of the Starlight Motel. She didn't hesitate. She gave her water, and then the sandwich she had saved for her own dinner. Arthur, seeing the situation, quietly went back to work, giving them space. Maya ate like she hadn't had a proper meal in days. Between bites, her story came out in broken fragments. The boyfriend, the fear, the running. She had no family to turn to, no money, no plan. "I can work," she said, her eyes pleading. "I can clean, or cook, or anything. I just need a safe place. Just for a little while." Eleanor looked at the small, separate space she had drawn at the far end of her floor plan. She had vaguely thought of it as a storage area. Now, she saw it differently. "We don't have much," Eleanor said honestly. "As you can see. But it's dry. And it's safe." That night, Maya slept on a pile of blankets in the far end of the train car. It was the first time in weeks she had slept with a roof over her head without being afraid. For Eleanor and Arthur, her presence was a strange comfort. The cavernous, lonely space of the car felt a little less empty. Maya proved true to her word. She was a tireless worker. She took over the cleaning, organized the growing collection of tools and materials, and insisted on helping Eleanor with hauling supplies. She had a quiet, resilient spirit that reminded Eleanor of her younger self. She didn't ask for charity, she contributed. A week later, another stray found them. He was a teenager, maybe 17, with a shock of messy black hair and a sullen expression that didn't quite hide the fear in his eyes. He had been lurking around the property for a day, watching them from a distance. Arthur finally went out to talk to him. The boy's name was Leo. His deeply religious parents had kicked him out when they found out he was gay. Like Maya, he had nowhere to go. He was wary, defensive, expecting rejection. "I don't want a handout," he said, his arms crossed. "But I saw your generator. I can fix stuff. Electronics. Small engines. Anything like that." Arthur, a man who respected skill above all else, was intrigued. The generator had been running rough for a few days. He grunted and pointed. "Have a look." Leo opened his worn backpack and took out a small, meticulously organized kit of precision tools. Within an hour, he had dismantled the carburetor, cleaned it, and retuned the engine. When he started it up again, it purred with a smooth, consistent rhythm they hadn't heard since they bought it. Arthur was impressed. "Where'd you learn to do that?" "YouTube," Leo said with a shrug. "And just tinkering." That evening, Leo joined them for dinner, a simple soup Maya had made over a camp stove. He, too, was given a space in the train car. He was quiet and kept to himself, but the next day, he got to work. He ran temporary wiring from the generator, setting up a proper, safe series of lights and a charging station for their phones. He found a discarded car battery and rigged a system to store excess power, allowing them to turn off the noisy generator for hours at a time. An unconventional and unintentional community was forming. An elderly couple, a pregnant runaway, and a homeless teenager, all living in a half-finished train car in a field of weeds. It was a bizarre collection of society's cast-offs. The ecosystem they created was one of pure symbiosis. Arthur was the master builder, the structural heart. Eleanor was the planner and logistician, managing their meager resources and their growing debt to George. Maya was the domestic core, turning the rough space into a semblance of a home, ensuring they were fed and the space was clean. Leo was the technician, the wizard of wires and watts who brought light and power to their small world. They weren't a family in any traditional sense. They were a crew. Each member contributed their skills in exchange for safety and shelter. There was no sentimentality about it, just a shared, unspoken understanding of mutual need. The progress on the car accelerated dramatically. With Leo handling the complex electrical work and Maya providing support, Arthur was free to focus on the carpentry. The kitchen cabinets, made from wood salvaged from discarded pallets, took shape. He framed the bathroom and, with plumbing supplies advanced by a now deeply invested George Hobbs, began the arduous task of running pipes for a sink and a toilet. George became a regular visitor. He'd drive out in his old pickup truck, ostensibly to drop off supplies, but really to inspect Arthur's work. He'd walk through the car, nodding in quiet approval at a perfectly fitted joint or a cleverly designed storage solution. He started bringing them leftovers from the diner and bags of produce from his own garden. He never called it charity. He called it a professional courtesy. One afternoon, he brought a friend with him, a retired electrician named Sal. Sal was skeptical at first, but after Leo walked him through his wiring schematics, drawn neatly in one of Leo's school notebooks, the old electrician was stunned. "Kid, you could test for your journeyman's license tomorrow," Sal said, shaking his head in disbelief. He spent the rest of the afternoon with Leo, teaching him tricks of the trade, pointing out ways to make his already impressive work compliant with official electrical codes. The train car was transforming. It was no longer a hollow shell. It was a complex, functioning organism. It was insulated, wired, and plumbed. It had a floor. It had interior walls. It had the beginnings of a kitchen. It was starting to feel like a home. Eleanor would sometimes stand in the doorway in the evening and just watch. She'd see Arthur showing Leo how to properly use a wood chisel. She'd see Maya humming to herself as she swept the floor, her hand resting on her growing belly. She'd see the warm glow of the lights, a defiant beacon in the darkness. They had started this project to save themselves. But somewhere along the way, it had become something more. They hadn't just built a shelter, they had created a sanctuary. They had taken in the broken and the discarded, just as they themselves had been. The small, rusted train car had become a lifeboat, and it was getting fuller. The snowball, set in motion by a single, desperate act, was gathering mass and momentum, rolling towards a future none of them could have predicted. The sense of fragile peace was shattered on a crisp autumn morning. A pristine white county vehicle, official seal emblazoned on the door, bumped down their gravel track. A man in a uniform with a clipboard stepped out, his face set in a stern, bureaucratic mask. He was from the county's code enforcement office. "I'm Inspector Davies," he announced, his eyes sweeping over their strange homestead with undisguised disapproval. "We've received a complaint about an unpermitted dwelling on this property." Eleanor's heart went cold. A complaint? Someone had reported them. A nosy neighbor, perhaps, disturbed by the light from their generator or the sounds of construction. The inspector walked around the train car, making notes on his clipboard. He peered inside, his expression souring further as he saw the four of them living there. "This is a railroad car," he stated, as if they were unaware of this fact. "It is not a legally recognized residential structure. You don't have permits. You don't have a certificate of occupancy. You don't have a proper septic system." Arthur tried to explain. "The work is solid. The wiring is being done by a licensed electrician. We're putting in a composting toilet system that..." Inspector Davies held up a hand, cutting him off. "I don't care if it was built by angels. It's not up to code because it's not a house. It's a violation. A major 1-inch. He took a bright orange piece of paper from his clipboard and slapped it onto the door Arthur had so carefully installed. It was a condemnation notice. "You have 30 days to vacate the premises," the inspector said, his voice devoid of any sympathy. "And to remove this structure. If you fail to comply, the county will remove it at your expense, and you will be subject to significant fines." He got back in his car and drove away, leaving them staring at the orange notice. The stark, black letters seemed to mock them. Condemned. It was a death sentence for their new life. The despair that descended was heavier than anything they had felt before, even in the motel. Then, they had only lost the past. Now, they were about to lose the future they had just started to build. The energy and purpose of the last few months evaporated, replaced by a crushing sense of futility. But this time, they were not alone. Maya, her face pale but resolute, tore the notice off the door. "No," she said fiercely. "He can't do this. We've worked too hard." Leo, who had been silent throughout the encounter, looked at the notice in Maya's hand. "There's always a loophole," he said, his voice quiet but intense. "Systems have rules. That means they have workarounds." That evening, their small community, which now included George Hobbs and Sal the electrician, who had arrived for their now daily check-in, gathered inside the train car. The mood was grim. "He's right," Sal said, rubbing his tired face. "From a code perspective, this thing is a nightmare. It's not zoned for residential. It's not a recognized housing type. You can't just get a permit for a train car." George, ever the pragmatist, was grim. "You could fight it. Go to the county board. But that takes time and money. You have neither." It seemed hopeless. 30 days. An impossible deadline. Then Leo spoke up. He called it a railroad car, he called it a structure, but he also called it a dwelling. What if it's not a dwelling? What if it's a vehicle? They all looked at him, confused. "It has wheels," Leo pointed out. "They are rusted to the tracks, but they are there. It was designed to be mobile. RVs are vehicles. Tiny homes on wheels are vehicles. They have different rules." A new energy filled the room. Eleanor's mind, the bookkeeper's mind, latched onto the idea. A change in classification. It was a classic bureaucratic maneuver. "The problem is, it hasn't moved in 50 years, Arthur said, ever the realist. And it's on a piece of track that goes nowhere. So we make it move," Leo said, his eyes bright with the challenge. The plan that formed over the next hour was audacious, bordering on insane. They couldn't move the whole train car. But they could prove it was mobile. They needed to get the wheels to turn. And they needed to bring the rest of the interior up to the code for a recreational vehicle, not a house. The standards were different, in some ways looser, but still exacting. The community rallied. This was no longer just Arthur and Eleanor's problem. It was their collective fight. George Hobbs called in more favors. A retired plumber named Frank, a gruff man who owed George for a long-forgotten kindness, showed up the next day to help Arthur with the septic plan, designing a self-contained tank system that would meet RV standards. Sal put his own license on the line, working with Leo day and night to finalize the electrical system, documenting every connection, every gauge of wire, creating a thick binder of schematics and compliance notes. Maya, whose baby was due in a matter of weeks, took on the role of project manager, keeping lists, running for supplies, and making sure everyone was fed. Eleanor became the researcher, spending her days back at the Harmony Creek Library, printing out pages and pages of county ordinances, zoning laws, and the specific state vehicle code pertaining to recreational vehicles. She found the loophole Leo had predicted. A structure could be classified as an RV if it was designed for temporary habitation, was under a certain square footage, and was demonstrably mobile. The hardest part was the wheels. Arthur, George, and a half-dozen other retired tradesmen they had roped into the cause spent a week working on the Pullman's undercarriage. They lay on their backs in the dirt and mud, using immense wrenches, blowtorches, and gallons of rust penetrant to attack the seized axles. It was grueling, filthy work. For days, nothing budged. It seemed impossible. Word of their strange project and their fight with the county had spread through Harmony Creek. People started showing up. The waitress from the diner brought a hot casserole. The pastor from the local church, a young woman named Sarah, came by and offered to help organize a petition. The story of the old couple who had been cheated by their son and were now building a new life, only to be shut down by the government, resonated with the town's independent, anti-bureaucratic spirit. The day before the inspector was due to return, as morale was hitting a new low, there was a loud groaning sound from beneath the car, followed by a sharp crack. One of the wheels had moved. Just a fraction of an inch. But it had moved. A ragged cheer went up from the exhausted crew. It was all they needed. They redoubled their efforts, and by nightfall, using a massive hydraulic jack borrowed from a local farm, they had managed to get all 8 wheels to turn. They were stiff, they screeched in protest, but they turned. The train car was, by a technical definition, mobile. In the midst of this frantic, hopeful chaos, another car bumped down their driveway. It wasn't a county vehicle. It was a sleek, black sedan. Richard got out. He looked different. His expensive suit was slightly rumpled. There were dark circles under his eyes. He stared at the scene before him with utter bewilderment. The train car, once a derelict wreck, was now a hub of activity. Lights glowed from its windows. People were crawling all over it. It looked like a bizarre Amish barn raising. He saw his mother, Eleanor, directing 2 men who were installing a small porch on the front. He saw his father, Arthur, covered in grease and dirt, laughing with another old man. He saw the pregnant girl and the punk teenager. What is all this?" he asked, his voice a mixture of confusion and disgust. Eleanor turned to face him. The frail, broken woman he had left in a motel parking lot was gone. In her place stood a woman who was tired, yes, but also strong, resolute, and in command. "This is our home, Richard," she said, her voice even. "This is a circus," he sneered, his old arrogance returning. "I heard you were living in a junkyard, but I didn't believe it. Look at you. Living with hobos," he gestured dismissively at Maya and Leo. "This is pathetic. What will people think? I've come to take you out of here. The offer at Oak Meadows is still good. I'll make the call. We can put this embarrassment behind us." He truly believed he was the hero, come to rescue them from their own foolishness. He saw their project not as an act of survival and creation, but as a personal insult to him, a stain on his reputation. Eleanor looked at her son. She felt no anger. She felt no hatred. She felt a deep, profound pity. He couldn't see. He was blind to the love, the community, the dignity that had been built here. He only saw surfaces, appearances, and money. "You left us with nothing, Richard," she said, her voice quiet but carrying in the sudden silence as everyone stopped to watch the confrontation. "You took our home, our security, our past. You left us to rot." She gestured to the people around her. "These people, these hobos, they gave us everything. They gave us their skill, their time, their loyalty. They helped us build this." She swept her arm to indicate the transformed train car. "This is more of a home than that house ever was after you got your hands on it. This home was built with respect. That one was stolen with deceit." Richard stared at her, his mouth opening and closing, unable to form a response. He was losing control, and he didn't know why. These were his parents. They were supposed to be weak, compliant, grateful. "You are not welcome here, Richard," Eleanor said, the words falling like stones into a deep well. "This is a place for builders, not takers. You should go." Arthur came and stood beside her, his hand resting on her shoulder. He didn't say a word. He just looked at his son with weary, disappointed eyes. Richard looked from his mother's implacable face to his father's silent judgment. He looked at the strangers who were watching him, their faces a mixture of pity and contempt. He was the outsider here. He, the successful son in the expensive car, was the one who didn't belong. With a choked sound of fury and humiliation, he turned, got back in his car, and sped away, kicking up a cloud of dust that settled over the condemned home he had failed to comprehend. The day of the final inspection arrived. It was the 30th day. The air was tense. The small community, Arthur, Eleanor, Maya, Leo, George, Sal, Frank, and a dozen other townspeople who had come to offer moral support, gathered by the train car. Inspector Davies' white county vehicle pulled up precisely at 9 a.m. He got out, clipboard in hand, a smug, expectant look on his face. He clearly anticipated finding the property abandoned, the train car still sitting there in violation, ready for him to start issuing fines. Instead, he found a delegation waiting for him. Eleanor, holding a thick binder, stepped forward. "Good morning, Inspector Davies," she said, her voice calm and professional. "We're ready for the inspection." Davies looked taken aback. "Inspection? The 30 days are up. The notice was for you to vacate and remove the structure. We believe we have complied with the spirit of the law, if not the letter of your initial assessment," Eleanor continued smoothly, using the formal, bureaucratic language she knew he would understand. "We are reclassifying the structure. It is not a permanent dwelling. It is a recreational vehicle." Davies blinked, then let out a short, incredulous laugh. "A recreational vehicle? That's a 50-ton railroad car." "Which is demonstrably mobile," Leo piped up from the back. At a signal from Arthur, two of the men put their shoulders to a massive lever they had rigged to one of the axles. With a tremendous groan of protesting metal, the entire train car shifted, the wheels turning a full 6 inches along the track. It was a small movement, but it was undeniable. The car had moved. Inspector Davies' jaw dropped. He stared at the wheel, then back at the group, his smugness evaporating into sheer astonishment. "Now," Eleanor said, opening her binder. "If you'll come inside, our licensed electrician and plumber are here to walk you through the systems, which have all been brought up to the specific code for a Class A recreational vehicle." Dumbfounded, the inspector followed her up the steps of the new porch and into the train car. The transformation from the derelict shell he had seen a month ago was staggering. The interior was clean, bright, and functional. The walls were paneled in smooth, pale wood. A compact, immaculate kitchen lined one wall. A small, enclosed bathroom stood at the end. The wiring was neat, encased in proper conduit. The plumbing was visible and professionally installed. Sal and Frank, the retired tradesmen, stepped forward. With quiet pride, they began to walk the inspector through their work, using the correct terminology, pointing out how every junction box, every P-trap, every shut-off valve met or exceeded the state's RV code. Leo was there with his own binder, showing the inspector his wiring diagrams and the specifications for the self-contained septic system. The inspector was silent, his pen hovering over his clipboard. He ran his hand along a seamless wall panel Arthur had installed. He opened a kitchen cabinet and noted the perfect, precise joinery. He looked at the floor plan Eleanor had taped to the wall, a model of efficiency and clever design. He was a bureaucrat, a man of rules and regulations, but he was also not an idiot. He recognized quality craftsmanship when he saw it. This was not the work of squatters. This was the work of masters. He spent over an hour inside, checking every outlet, testing the water pressure in the sink, asking pointed, technical questions that Sal and Frank answered with ease. Finally, he emerged, his face unreadable. He stood on the porch, looking out at the anxious faces watching him. He looked at the orange condemnation notice, which was still taped to the wall next to the door. He slowly reached out, peeled the notice off the wall, and tore it into 4 neat pieces. "Well, I'll be damned," he said, shaking his head in disbelief. He looked at Arthur, a new respect in his eyes. "This isn't a train car anymore. It's a home. A damn fine 1-inch. He turned to Eleanor. "Your reclassification is unorthodox. But based on my inspection, the documented mobility, and the compliance of the internal systems with RV code, I have no grounds to enforce the condemnation." He clicked his pen and made a final note on his clipboard. "As far as the county is concerned, you're the proud owners of a very, very large recreational vehicle. Just try not to take it on the highway." A smile touched the corner of his mouth. He tipped his hat to them, got in his car, and drove away. For a moment, there was stunned silence. Then, a huge cheer erupted from the crowd. George Hobbs let out a whoop and clapped Arthur on the back so hard he almost fell over. Maya was crying and laughing at the same time. Leo, for the first time since he'd arrived, broke into a wide, unrestrained grin. Eleanor felt Arthur's arm go around her shoulders. She leaned against him, the tension of the last month draining out of her in a single, shuddering breath. They had won. Against all odds, they had won. It was a victory not of aggression or revenge, but of patience, skill, and community. It was the quiet, profound vindication of the competent. The story, however, did not end there. The waitress who had brought the casserole also happened to be a stringer for the regional newspaper. The tale of the betrayed elderly couple, the band of misfits, the condemned train car, and the stunning victory over the bureaucracy was too good to pass up. A week later, it was on the front page of the Sunday paper, complete with a picture of the whole crew standing proudly in front of their strange, beautiful home. The headline read, "Discarded couple build new life, new family in Harmony Creek train car." The story went viral. It was picked up by news aggregators, shared on social media by thousands of people who were captivated by the story of resilience and rebellion. Donations started pouring into a fund the pastor had set up. A local solar company offered to install a full solar array on the roof for free. The story became a symbol of hope for people who felt forgotten or powerless. Of course, the article also found its way to Richard. The public shaming was swift and brutal. His name was mentioned, his actions laid bare. The can't-miss business deal, funded by the sale of his parents' home, came under scrutiny. It turned out to be a poorly conceived venture on the verge of collapse. His investors, angered by the negative publicity, pulled out. Richard Jensen, the man who valued reputation above all else, found his destroyed. He was facing lawsuits and financial ruin. The article also landed on the doorstep of Susan, the complacent daughter. She read it, saw the picture of her smiling parents surrounded by strangers who had become their family, and was consumed by a tidal wave of guilt and shame. She had been weak. She had been a coward. She had sided with the shark and abandoned her own parents. The aftermath was complex. Justice had been served, but it wasn't simple. Richard vanished into a vortex of legal and financial troubles, a prisoner of the very system of money and status he had worshipped. He never called. But Susan did. Her call was the final, unexpected consequence of their victory. It was the loose thread from their old life, suddenly, tentatively, being pulled. Life in the train car settled into a new, sustainable rhythm. The solar panels were installed, granting them silent, reliable power. The constant hum of the generator was replaced by the gentle whisper of the wind in the tall grasses. The community, forged in crisis, solidified in peace. Maya gave birth to a healthy baby girl, whom she named Elena, in honor of Eleanor. The train car, which had once been a dark, empty shell, now echoed with the soft coos of a newborn. The small room at the end of the car became a proper nursery, with a tiny crib Arthur built from leftover pine. Leo, with a glowing letter of recommendation from Sal, got a full-time job at Hobbs Hardware. George treated him like the grandson he never had, teaching him the business, grooming him to one day take over. The sullen, defensive boy had been replaced by a confident, capable young man who had found his place in the world. The donations that had poured in were used not for themselves, but to improve their small community. They bought the adjacent parcel of land when it came up for sale. They drilled a well for fresh water. With the help of their army of retired tradesmen, they began construction on a second, smaller structure, a workshop for Arthur and a proper bunkhouse for Leo and any other strays who might wander their way. The single lifeboat was becoming a small, safe harbor. Eleanor established a lush garden next to the train car. Rows of tomatoes, squash, and beans grew, their leaves turning sunlight into sustenance. The act of planting, of nurturing new life from the soil, was a deep and profound comfort. It was a mirror of what they had done with their own lives. They had taken a barren patch and made it fruitful. One afternoon, a small, unfamiliar car pulled into their driveway. A woman got out. It was Susan. She looked older than Eleanor remembered, her face etched with a sorrow and regret that seemed to have settled deep in her bones. She stood awkwardly by her car, not approaching the train car, as if she were afraid to cross an invisible line. Eleanor, who was weeding her garden, stood up, wiping the dirt from her hands onto her apron. The two women looked at each other across the yard. The silence stretched, filled with the weight of things unsaid, of calls not returned, of a fundamental trust broken. "Mom," Susan finally said, her voice thick with emotion. I read the article. I saw the pictures," she gestured vaguely at the train car, the garden, the new construction. "I am so sorry." She didn't make excuses. She didn't blame Richard. She didn't try to justify her silence. "I was weak," she whispered, tears rolling down her cheeks. "And I was wrong. There's no excuse for it. I was a coward." Eleanor looked at her daughter, her only daughter. She saw the genuine remorse in her eyes. She remembered the little girl who used to follow her around the house, the teenager she had taught to balance a checkbook, the young woman she had been so proud of. The anger, which had long ago cooled to a scar, felt distant now. It was part of a different life. She didn't offer a grand speech of forgiveness. She didn't absolve her daughter of her failings. The past could not be erased. But the future could be different. Eleanor simply nodded. "The tea is on," she said, her voice gentle. She turned and walked up the steps to the porch. She opened the door to the train car, holding it open a little wider than necessary. It was an invitation. Susan hesitated for a moment, then, with a sob of relief, she walked across the yard and into the strange, beautiful home her parents had built without her. It was not a resolution. It was a beginning. It was the slow, tentative mending of a broken bond. The door was open. Months passed. The seasons turned. Summer faded into a golden autumn, the leaves on the few trees on their property turning brilliant shades of orange and red. The bunkhouse was completed. The garden yielded its final harvest. Susan became a regular visitor, her visits quiet and tentative at first, then more frequent and comfortable. She would bring her own children, who were awestruck by their grandparents' unconventional home. They began to forge a new relationship, one built not on assumption and obligation, but on a clear-eyed understanding of past failures and a shared desire for future connection. Richard remained a ghost. They heard through Susan that his legal troubles were mounting, his marriage had failed, and he had moved away, chasing another phantom opportunity in another state. He was a non-entity, a closed chapter in a book they no longer read. One cool evening, Eleanor and Arthur sat on the porch Arthur had built, the same way they had sat so many nights before. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of wood smoke from the small stove inside. Arthur had his arm around her. Winston, now an old and contented cat, was curled in Eleanor's lap, his purr a rumbling motor of peace. From the bunkhouse, they could hear the faint sound of Leo's radio playing. From the main car, they could hear Maya softly singing a lullaby to baby Elena. The sounds were a gentle symphony of their new life. Eleanor looked at the hands resting on her lap, her own hands, wrinkled and spotted with age. They were the hands of a bookkeeper, hands that had tracked numbers and balanced ledgers. She looked at Arthur's hands, resting on his knee, gnarled and powerful, the hands of a carpenter who had built and fixed and created. Together, their hands had signed the paper that had destroyed their world. And together, their hands had built a new one. Arthur followed her gaze. He picked up one of her hands and held it in his. His touch was warm, familiar, a comfort she had known for more than 50 years. "You were right," he said, his voice a low rumble. "It was a crazy chance." "The only one we had," she replied softly. They sat in comfortable silence, watching the last sliver of sun dip below the horizon. The single, unadorned bulb on their porch flickered on, its steady glow a small but defiant star against the deepening twilight. It was a beacon for the lost, a symbol of their resilience, a testament to the simple, profound truth that a home is not a building, but the love and dignity that fill it. The light stayed on,